Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast. And before we get into today's interview, which is a paradigm deep dive on the Hollowers and Goth Magic with James Sambrano, I have a few community updates. First, friend of the show, Nathan Sievert, has restarted the Nerd Word podcast as 2D10 and is covering all sorts of horror and Old World of Darkness topics, as well as a few other things in gaming at large. He had me on to talk about the state of Mage the Ascension and the Old World of Darkness, and that interview is available at utilitymuffinlabs.com. There's also a link in the show notes. Nathan has also agreed to do a recorded live play of my Mage one-shot Justice Ascendant, but he kind of said it off the cuff, so we'll see if that actually happens, but I hope it does, and when it does, I'll jam it in the feed or at least give you a link to it, and I'm pretty jazzed to run that. Community member Undead Foodstuff has posted another episode of their Mage Storytime series, and this one is about a rescue mission to save a doomed technocratic ship, and the link is in the show notes. I also wanted to tell you about some of the upcoming episodes we have. I'm starting a new series called Mage Across Time and Space, which discusses the considerations in how to run Mage in different places and different times, and I have a bunch of interviews for that already lined up, and if you are a subject matter expert and have played Mage before and would like to talk about a particular place and time, give us a holler, and maybe we can record something at it. And with that, on with the show. So James, how you doing?
I'm very busy right now. I've had a lot going on the writing side of my career and also on the COVID side of my career. I'm one of those rare people who my job got more intensive during the shutdown. Right now, like I would say a huge amount of my time is devoted to writing Werewolf 5th edition. But that said, whenever this comes out, maybe I'll be done. I hope I'm done by then. I should have been done already. Yeah.
We are doing that thing that every show does where they have James Sambrano, recognized source material expert, to come on and talk about something that James is familiar with, Goths. So the topic today is Goths in Mage and kind of the hollow ones. So we're going to talk about the paradigm and we're going to talk about the group and culture a little bit. Before that starts, can you please establish your bona fides for our audience? You have so much eyeliner on now, it's uncomfortable.
We're on video, so not everyone can see this. So, I don't know when I first accepted that I was Goth. Well, because, back then, I feel like it's a lot more socially acceptable now. Back then, like, it was immediate bully material. It was immediate, like, you had so much, like, negativity being directed your way. So a lot of time people would be like, oh, you're Goth. And I'd be like, no, I'm not. But, like, so it's hard for me to say what, when I joined that subculture, I guess. It wasn't like a conscious thought. It was just like, I wore darker clothes. I wore makeup. And you know what? Honestly, when I look back on that as an adult, I actually think the reason I started playing around with, like, nail polish and lipstick and eyeliner and stuff like that was a lot more to do with some gender expression stuff I was dealing with, but it also was mostly black. So yeah, there's that. And then there's also, like, obviously, like, a certain, like, I was small a awakened to a certain subgenre of music, and also a larger subgenre of just, like, more like sad emotional. To this day, like, I am obsessed with just the saddest music. It's all my favorite music is super sad. My three favorite bands are, none of them I guess would be qualified as goth, but my favorite bands are the Smashing Pumpkins, which is all misery love songs. Leonard Cohen, who I think isn't technically goth, but honestly should be an honorary goth, and Godspeed You Black Emperor, which doesn't have any lyrics, but is all really sad sounding music because it's all about the end of the world.
I channeled my love of lipstick, eyeliner, and artificial lashes into musical theater, which it's interesting how the two have swapped in terms of acceptability. Over time.
It's also, now that I think about it, it's also interesting when I go back to, like, those years of my life, the, like, middle school to high school years, that there was a lot of overlap in the people who wanted to get into that and goths. And then also, here's the other thing I'm gonna say as part of my qualification. From where I'm sitting right now, I can see the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 trench coats I have hanging over there, and they're all completely different styles.
See, at that point, that's no longer goth. That's a cry for help or a sign that you worked for White Wolf in the 1990s.
I also grew up primarily surrounded by either Mexican or indigenous culture. And if you don't know this already, there's, if you've seen Orange is the New Black, actually, there's a really good example of it in the character Flaca. But there is a huge amount of Mexican goths. Like, it is not a small thing. And also there's goths all over the res. So, like, I had a lot of, like, older kids around. So I was kind of like one of those kids who hung out with older kids because I was, like, a little bit too, I thought about life a little bit too seriously for my age group. So a lot of my friends were older. And because of that, I had all these goth Mexicans and natives around me who were like, hey, what up? Hang out with us. Also, Marilyn Manson sucks. But and then here's the other qualifier. And some people are going to hear this and be like, what the fuck? This makes you not an expert on this. I was the store manager for Hot Topic for about 7 years.
Okay, that's you are officially unimpeachable in terms of that. So
what I think that makes me a particular expert on is an important thing to talk about, like about what happened to the goth subculture between the 90s and now, and how it was hurt and how it was damaged and what it is today compared to what it was then, and why you have this big like severing like canyon between quote unquote traditional goths and the larger amount of goths who call themselves that today. And if you want to go into mage lore, they talk about it as the Syndicate making a very specific and horrific attack against the Hollow Ones and kind of destroying a lot of their culture and sub networks.
The Syndicate is notable for kind of a pump and dump tactic where they find anything that could be a mythic thread, for lack of a better term, that is gaining any purchase in mainstream society, commercializes the shit out of it, makes money off of it, and then demonizes it. So the example they make is the idea of not quite before the Satanic Panic, but in the early 90s when you had a neo-pagan thing that was coming up where they started, the Syndicate caught wind of this, started pumping out like, oh, find your totem on your spirit animal, which is a phrase white people should just never use, and selling like, get this anathem that has been custom made, and then after making a whole bunch of money off of it, just kind of being like, their media division turning on that and being like, the secret menace, the things your kids are worshiping when you're not home. You're purporting that they did the same thing with the Goths.
Yeah, and I think part of the dump aspect of what you're talking about too is like you overwhelm the quote unquote masses with this vision of what you're making that subculture, what the Syndicate is making that subculture, to the point where it's no longer what it was originally. What I would say is, like, if you did word association right now and you thought goths, like Hot Topic's going to come up. It's going to come up in your head. You're going to think about goth, like when South Park explored goths, it was through the idea of them turning against Hot Topic, but it's going to come up in your head. You aren't going to think necessarily of Alien Sex Fiend. You aren't going to think necessarily of like the Sex Gang Children or the Death Cult. You're not going to think of Light Asylum. You're not even necessarily going to think of Susie. Like I know a lot of people who are actually more familiar with the subculture. Oh, of course they will. But the masses are going to think, oh, Hot Topic kids, that's goths. So you kind of like destroyed a lot of the association, a lot of the like things that they consider sacred by associating with a store, with something that just sells their culture.
Can you give us then a quick overview of what the goth subculture we're going to talk about roughly includes? A time period, maybe a short list of inspirations, what the key ideas or philosophies would be. That way we have kind of a start for the rest of the conversation.
Okay, quick. It is a subculture that you saw emerging in the late 70s and really blowing up in the 80s, and also having a lot of like mass market appeal in the 90s. But essentially, it was originally tied to a manner of dressing that was like a side culture of punk, which was more macabre. It was like black and white. It was embracing like images that associated with death, like skulls and bones and spiders and bats and shit like that. Like, a lot of that stuff came a little bit more later, but I'm just talking about the general like look. Mm-hmm. A lot of it was honestly in the beginning was just the black and white. You're going with a lot of like wearing black, lightening up your skin and make yourself look more corpse-like. And it quickly became also a musical revolution, again, as a side, like it kind of came out of punk in a lot of ways, but you can argue about the different directions it came from too. And that musical subgenre, you're going to, like I mentioned some of the bands earlier, but like Bauhaus, Susie Sue, Nick Cave is pretty gothy, even though he gets associated with punk. Joy Division is like a proto-goth band. And those are like the 80s. In the 90s, what you experienced was it as in all musical influences, it started to infiltrate and influence and develop new musical genres. And you had things like Gothic metal and other things like that a lot of the traditional goths will say don't count as goth, but like Marilyn Manson isn't Gothic music. He does borrow from the Gothic style. And the Gothic style tends to focus on the emotions associated around horror and terror as part of their style. So you also see a lot of like horror movie reference with being goth too.
And is it specifically Gothic literature and Gothic horror? The definition to me of Gothic horror versus other types of horror is usually you are falling victim to something someone else did. Gothic horror is when the ghost haunts you because your ex-husband was a serial killer, not because you're the serial killer.
When you're talking about literature and horror, which also is an important theme of this, I don't think that I think that you have a lot of roots coming out of that, but I don't think that you necessarily are limited to that. Goths are pretty open to interpreting like everything into their own way. And an aspect of being goth is being really individualistic. You don't even necessarily, today, you have all these subcategories of goth, and one of my favorites that sometimes I lean into a little bit aesthetically is pastel goths, who like to incorporate a lot of color into their particular setup, which wasn't originally not something that was really part of the look.
Where did the Victorian Edwardian Belle Epoque dress come from? Like the revival of those late Victorian and early Edwardian dress come from?
Well, I think it's arguable, and I think that different people might say slightly different things because the quote-unquote history of Gothic subculture isn't something that you can really just easily pick up a book on. There might be one out there. I don't know what it is. I haven't read it. So a really important aspect, I think, of what it is to be goth is what you see is beautiful, and it's seeing beauty in the macabre, it's seeing beauty in grief, it's seeing beauty in horror, which is why those become aesthetics, right? And that was something that certain poets like Edgar Allan Poe could do, right? And you have a lot of associations with him and other people from that period with that look, with the Edwardian, with the Victorian stuff. On top of that, one thing that I didn't mention that actually can't really be ignored about the Gothic subculture is that it really originates from like poor white kids in the UK. And so they're drawing on their own specific heritage and their Victorian heritage to play around with. You have like the different kinds of like the way people were dying then and like using that as like aesthetic. There's so many different directions we can go with that.
Now you make me think that there's a world where the goth subculture came out of like the American West and like the goths were informed by cowboy culture instead of like Belle Epoque culture. And I want to see that world now.
You can see that when you watch a Rob Zombie video.
Noted. So you said something super important to me, which I feel is going to be the nut of things, seeing the beauty in death, suffering, and horror. It sounds what you're portraying is this combination of romanticism almost with resignation. Like, what would you consider to be the emotional core then of that artistic movement?
It's hard to say that goths have unifying worldviews. I think you can find a few common themes, but like with almost everything, like even though you could argue that the style is very conformist, you still can't argue that that style isn't conformist with the rest of the world. And so it actually celebrates individuality in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of emphasis on being an individual. So it's really hard for me to say, oh yes, this is what everyone thinks. But I would say you do find those themes. You do find the themes of not just appreciation of the beauty in the macabre, but also a celebration of that beauty. And honestly, the thing you said about what if goth culture came out of cowboys in the West is interesting to me because I mentioned right when we started that like I had so much influence from Mexican goths growing up. And if you have like much knowledge of like indigenous Mexican culture, you know that there is like a totally different relationship with death and the dead than Western culture has. And like a really simple example of that is like if you don't know a lot about that is go watch the movie Coco. It'll give you like some introductory like ideas of that. But like of course you grieve the people you've lost. Like everyone grieves the people they've lost. But the way like Mexican indigenous culture and now like Mexican culture today, but it's borrowed, it's like I want to be clear that it comes from indigeneity, not from colonizers, because Mexican culture today is a mix of both. There's like a celebration of death. You have Dia de los Muertos, where you honor your dead family, and you have like parties with your living family to honor them, and you celebrate death. If you look at any of like the art surrounding Dia de los Muertos, you celebrate death in a very colorful way with flowers and living things on skeletons, right? And so that, even though that is not where the goth subculture comes from, I do think very strongly that aspect of it is why they're, at least for in my anecdotal experience growing up in Southern California, is why the goth subculture appeals to Mexicans so easily, to Mexican kids.
Starting with that, we kind of have this philosophical locus. Now, when we translate that to doing magic, what are the foundational beliefs that you feel a Gothic-inspired mage is drawing on to change the world? Like when I think of a paradigm, I think of either tenets or axioms, depending on if it's technocratic or non-technocratic. And it says there are fundamental ways in which a mage of this worldview believes the world works that other people don't, or other people don't as strongly. And that is the basic paradigm element that allows that person to change the world when combined with enlightened will. What to you are kind of those fundamental statements about a Gothic worldview where one sees the world in a different way than other people and allows them to do magic then?
The reason that the Hollow Ones, we're going to go to the mage group, right? The reason that the Hollow Ones are as powerful a group as they are when you look at, like people sometimes look at them on the surface and they're like, why is this group so important? They're just a bunch of goths. Is because, and also they'll say themselves, they're a craft of orphans. They're primarily a bunch of orphans who have come together with some similar ideas. But the reason that they are what they are and why they hold such an important place in this story is because of what the World of Darkness is in itself as a setting. It's a Gothic punk storytelling game of horror, right? It's right there in the title, but also every single subsetting of the World of Darkness deals with the idea of the end of the world in some way or another. You have Gehenna, you have Apocalypse, even Ascension is an end of the world. Ascension is still like the end of the world as we know it. And they're also battling forces that do want to end it permanently. So the World of Darkness, even though it's a reflection of ours, isn't ours. It's like this. It's Earth 617. It's not Earth 616, right? And everything in it is essentially darker. It's and I mean not just like color wise, but thematically. Like crimes are worse. Poverty is worse. Buildings are crumbling. There's more shadows in the dark places. It's harder to get out of like bad situations. Everything is more and more awful. So you have these factions, and I think the way the other World of Darkness factions look at the end of the world is important when discussing the Hollow Ones too, because sometimes they prefer to hang out with like vampires over mages because they're fucking sick of mages. Essentially, you have all these different factions looking at how the world is ending and how you can visibly see it ending around you in a slow, sad, crying death for most people, at least from the Hollow One perspective. And what do you do with that? Because you can read studies today about how common depression and anxiety are getting, and it has a lot to do with how awful our environment is and how it feels our world is coming to an end in a lot of ways, and everything feels so negative and like there's and hopeless. Now this world's even worse. So what do you do with that? How do you survive that? Because if you just lean into it, like another thing that probably comes up in the World of Darkness is suicide rates are way higher than our world, but they're already really high in our world. And so if you want to survive that, you got to embrace that, but also you don't want to embrace it like the Nefandi. You don't want to become the evil in the world. You don't want to become the darkness. You want to see what is beautiful about that darkness. You want to see what is powerful about that darkness. You want to see what is attractive and exciting and cool and become that. I'm using all this to come around to, I think, one of the primary ways of interacting with magic from that point of view is going to be in reimagining yourself as not being a helpless kind of victim on the side of this ending of things, but rather being a hero in that story. Like, you're not going to escape that story. That's the story you're in. So you paint yourself with the aesthetics of that story, but you also paint yourself as a hero of that story. One of the things you see that's wrong with the world is like the crypto-fascists and the technocracy or whatever, right? And so you make it a point to constantly be a wrench in their works, but you do that in this like image of the thing that they've wrought, in your opinion, the decay of the world.
So the way I'm hearing that is the idea, one cornerstone of the Hollower belief is we each have the power to change the world, in that there is some great reservoir of strength inside of us. We just need to find a way to channel it. They are channeling it through the passions that come about through the emotional experience. And it just so happens that the lens they are choosing is one that is considered macabre. It is no better or worse than another one. Like, who's to say that that is better or worse than what occultist does, doing something that is hedonistic or sensual? This is just choosing a different range of emotions and kind of harnessing through that. That is kind of the interpretation I get from that emotions are powerful, that if we are willing to lean into them, we can affect change in the world. And politically or magically, we refuse to be bystanders as the world burns.
Exactly. I 100% agree with that. And also I would probably like nail down those specific emotions as being like horror, terror, and grief. I want to point out specifically what you just said is why they get called romantics. Because the romantics did believe essentially, like emotions are powerful. You need to lean into your passion. Like that is like the most important central basis of what it is to build art or make change in the world is your emotions and your passions. In the case of the Hollow Ones, it's just they are focusing on darker emotions. We might even be able to throw anger in there. I think anger tends to lean more punk, but I would also argue that while the Hollow Ones are presented as a very gothy group, they're also very much the punk side of Gothic in a lot of ways.
One of the fundamental difficulties with the Hollow Ones, to me, until I read the Revised Tradition book, is in first edition, the Hollow Ones was just almost interchangeable with Orphan. It was just the fact that there were enough orphans that they recognized other orphans and they called themselves Hollow Ones. In second edition, they were the Goths. And then in Revised, we got this kind of sharding that you had the Hollow One, if they were to be a tradition, their factions would be the Goths, the Postmoderns, and the Gutter Mages. The Goths are the romantics, that's the Neville Sinclair, kind of the main thrust that we get. But the other two, I think, are endlessly fascinating, just because it is the only group in Mage that is seemingly, with the possible exception of maybe the Syndicate, that recognizes that it is postmodern, like that it has a fundamental skepticism of meta-narratives baked into it. And part of the whole idea of, Hermetic, you can spend 12 hours creating a pentacle of Saturn to control that spirit. I'm going to do it with lipstick on a cocktail napkin.
They absolutely kind of turn a lot of that sacred traditionalism on its head and like spit it back out at you in a way that seems sacrilegious, but also get shit done. And it does come from their very skeptic, and you're right, that's the whole skepticism thing is very postmodern. That does come from that. I'm interested in talking more about your idea with the Syndicate being like that, because I'm not 100% sure how I feel about that, but we don't have to talk about that now. I think there's probably no convention that the Hollow Ones would hate more than Syndicate, which is interesting. That's why it makes it extra interesting to me.
It is the fact that they both understand that in a certain thing, that they recognize the malleability of reality kind of in this very fundamental way. They're both groups that, to me, really understand what the Ascension War is, and one is doubling down and trying to win it, where the other one has said, this is just stupid.
Or as I said earlier, this is bullshit.
Yeah, sorry. If we ever do Mage the Podcast bumper stickers, this is bullshit, James Sambrano. So is that skepticism, where does that come from? Because philosophically, the skepticism is not that magic isn't real, but the skepticism is of the belief that any group has a monopoly on truth. Theirs is to say, Hermetic, your sigil has power, but not for the reason you think it does. Or, hey, Chorister, your belief and prayer have power, but not for the reason you think it does. And they are a group that is very willing to shout that. Where does that kind of fit in? Is that just the punk aspect of that goth community that you talk about, or does that have older roots?
Well, I actually was going to say that I think it's associated with the punk leanings, and the two things. The one that the way goth culture is represented in the World of Darkness is very goth punk, and also that goth culture itself is, at least was born of punk in a lot of ways. Another thing you're looking at is when we go back to this paradigm discussion, you see the world for what it is. You see the world dying. Everything is fucked, but you're smart. If you don't take that on the surface level, you can also see why that's happening. You know who's causing it. You know who's at fault, you know who's responsible. And that tends to be the groups in power who are unwilling to change and who hold things up as like inviolably sacred. Whether that be like how important money is to power in the case of the Syndicate, or whether that be how important like endless years of rigorous education and accolades are to the Order of Hermes. Like all of it is bullshit, and all of it is why we're in such a bad place now.
It seems to me that one of their statements are that many of the trappings of paradigm are artificial complications created so that either one group can be a gatekeeper or can tie the hands of other groups. That if we force people to think they have to pray for 4 hours before they will get some sort of deliverance, that makes them come to our church and choose up their temporal resources in terms of being able to do anything else. We have this fast magic that kind of recognizes that these trappings are not the true magic, and that is kind of where they come from.
I agree with that, and I think that there's a whole lot like that healthy skepticism is why they're able to lean into that. But also, I was thinking about this thing that you said about the napkin, about the lipstick on a napkin thing, and you've used that quote with me before. We've talked about it before in the past.
It's mentioned in pardon me, Mage 20. I think uses lipstick on a quarter. As the replacement for the Hermetic. And it brings up this fundamental problem of, okay, it sounds like your magic is categorically better than anyone else's. What slows you down and what makes you special? From a storyteller perspective, that was always a question I had.
So kind of in game terms, we're talking about like high ritual versus like quick, just fast cast. And I think that the Hollow Ones have that too. But like maybe we don't see it the same way, because in a lot of ways we respect things like, the high ritual. I'm going to use the same examples we're using of the Syndicate and the Hermetics of being like, the way you manage your bank account and the way that you engage in like these actually high rituals of like summoning like the incarnate of Jupiter or whatever you're doing, as being like more respectable than what the Hollow Ones do. But hear me out. What character that engages in the aesthetic of the Hollow Ones, of the Goth culture, do you know that could roll out of bed and look like how they present themselves to the world? That is a high ritual. And also, I want to bring that back to the paradigm talk about how you make yourself the hero of this story. You make yourself into the image of who you can be. And it also leads to this idea of individuality because you get to choose who that is. So you get up in the morning and you painstakingly craft your image into who it is that you want to present yourself as through whatever that might be. It might be like the layers of clothes you have. It might be all your makeup. It might be, dyeing your hair or doing it a certain way or even wearing a wig. Here's a weird one. It might be training your cat to ride around on your shoulder. All of those things are aspects of the aesthetic of the crafting the hero, crafting who you are, crafting this individual that looks unique and powerful, and most importantly, cool.
I really like that way of interpreting it, the idea that they are not fast casting. Their persona is this giant focus that allows them to do something postmodern, essentially. But the other comparison, to go back to our previous episode, is like, dream speakers are OP. They can just ask the spirit of someone's gun to stop breaking, to not work. And your statement to that was like, yeah, if they had already established that relationship and gotten that going. So it seems fast, but it is like calling your friend to help them change a tire. It only appears that they're aiding you quickly, but that's because you've spent years investing in that friendship. That's pretty fascinating. So that, to me, indicates that if we're going to talk about systematically, the system then becomes something like the practices then become, what would that be? Persona craft or disguise or personages?
Like it comes up like the NWO does it and stuff like that too. Right?
Oh yeah. The uniform itself is almost magical unto itself, and the trappings of what you want to be. And that's pretty fascinating. And from there, we then get an explosion of instruments, assuming they fit into that. So, and it's also interesting in that their instruments are kind of bound by how familiar they are with the rest of the magical world. If you're going to make a postmodern commentary on it, you need to be familiar with everyone else's style to show that it is just a veneer cast on top of it, or to reinterpret it. So in this weird way, their focuses are kind of limited by their familiarity with other magic in some ways.
I think that's fair insight, but I also want to add on to that I also think that in the case of the Hollow Ones, their existence in a lot of ways, they might argue against this and be mad about this being said, but their existence in a lot of ways is they came about as a response to the traditions and technocracy and the Ascension War. They came about as like, mages awakening and being like, what is this crap? What is wrong with you all? And that's kind of also why they tend to be so postmodernist, right? Because they're very skeptical of all this stuff. And it's also why they don't have like their own like ancient sacred traditions they come from, because they don't have anything like that. They're a response to these other things. They're the criticism in the world of mage. They are the critics. And so what you have is like, they actually do tend to have pretty intimate knowledge of some of those other magical practices, because that's why they exist in the first place, because they saw those and were like, what the bullshit is this? I'm out.
And the interesting thing there is, I posit that the first Hollow One was born when the pyramids were being built, and some teenager is like, this is bullshit. They said it in like Demotic or something. But like, to me, that, yeah, if I got to write the Hollow One thing, like that is the ancient history I would add. It would just be a parade of historical events and angry people going, this is horse hockey. And that would be
that makes sense to me. What you're saying, the true spiritual core of who the Hollow Ones are the people who look back on what's happening about everything's fighting about and calling sacred and saying none of this is sacred. It's all a bunch of horse shit.
Do the Hollowers believe that nothing is sacred, or do they believe that the things other people find sacred are not?
I don't think that they think nothing is sacred, but I do think that they, by and large, not all of them, tend to believe that the majority of things that are held sacred by society at large are not at all. And again, I'm going to pick on our favorite convention here, at least it's my favorite convention. Our society considers cash to be sacred because cash is power and power is sacred, right? And I believe that outside of a few like rich air level kind of Hollow One, most of them are like, yeah, that's a bunch of crap. And I also think that, it's a really easy argument to make that they're also pretty anti-Christian in a lot of ways. But ultimately, what you need to look at is it's not about Christianity or money necessarily. What it's about is, who are the people who are causing the most harm in the world? How are they doing that? What is their justification for doing that? And that's what the bullshit is. That's what you're critical of. And so again, like I mentioned earlier about how they see this world and the state it's in, but they also can see who's causing the problem. So I think they're a lot less likely, for example, not always, but sometimes to look at someone like some group philosophies, like I would say like the cult of ecstasy and the dream speakers and definitely a lot of the disparates, because those groups aren't necessarily using what they hold sacred to cause all this damage in the world and to hurt people.
So they direct their skepticism against people, against the trappings that are tied to the institutions of power that they consider to be unjust.
I think that's right, but I think in the case, like, we can make that argument against like any kind of like
any group, yeah,
punky rebel group, right? Mm-hmm. Like against anything like that. But what separates them out is they're specifically focused on the end of the world. They're specifically focused on the dying world, on everything falling apart, everything becoming ashes. Yes, you can make arguments for hollow ones who are like, I'm fighting for justice. I find to make sure, like, you know, there's equity in the world. That those hollow ones exist, and that's a very goth belief. But also, I don't think that's like the primary focus. The primary focus is on who is screwing it up for everyone else. Those people are my targets of criticism, skepticism, and in some cases, but not always, war.
Well, that's interesting. So they are a group that is uniquely interested in tearing down the powerful more so than uplifting themselves.
I don't think they give a shit about uplifting themselves. Like, they get a little cliquish, right? So they have their own like little social circles where they like to dominate and be like, you know, snarky little jerks. But like, that's like their own little personal world. It's not the world at large. And when it comes to the world at large, I think they, in a lot of ways, they kind of accept that they're never going to be an important rung of the hierarchy of society. And they don't want to be, because they actually see that hierarchy as a bunch of trash.
So to bang on a little bit more about the Magick, what are some either practices or instruments that maybe come to mind when you think goth, but may not for someone who is kicking the tires on having a goth character or NPC for the first time?
You're always drawing back to the thing we talked about earlier about how important emotion and passion are. Like, you always want to come back to that. And I think it's, with some exceptions, it's fair to say that like just raw emotion and raw passion themselves don't tend to make good tools, magical tools in any way. However, the expressions of those things are what make great tools. And so, you know, you can look at all kinds of art, just like visual art and painting and stuff like that. I think that one of the most obvious ones is music, because even though the goth subculture didn't specifically start with goth music, it is absolutely wrapped up and defined by that now. And it also didn't spend much time not defined by that. So it's pretty much almost its whole life been defined by that. And so looking into both, I would say in the case in developing a paradigm, you can go two different directions. You can go in someone who creates the music and develops the music. Like, you can be a musician itself in the same way like a cultist might be, and use their, you know, and embrace their paradigm that way. But also, you ever hear like some stereotypical things people say about goths, like, oh, you know, there's those teenagers in the cemetery at midnight again listening to Bauhaus or Zymox or whatever, listening to that music, engaging in that feeling that music gives you. And I would say goth music is really good at touching on like those elements that we talked about before, like horror and grief, but also tension, which is another thing Godspeed is good at. You get into that headspace where you're manipulating your own emotions through that music, then you can do magic. Tell you what you've done. Because if you walk through the cemetery at night, that has a certain feeling. If you've done this before, and I imagine plenty of Mage listeners probably have done this a couple times in their life.
Oh yeah, I think it's super fun.
Yeah, but you have a feeling. There's something that impacts the way you're perceiving the world. It impacts the way you're perceiving the world. Like, you look at the darkness differently. You look at the shadows differently. You think differently about the ground that you're walking on. Like, you know, not everyone does this, but plenty of people who walk through the cemetery at night are super conscious about where they're placing their feet, because they're thinking about the corpses beneath them and either being respectful or not respectful. Like, but either way, they're very conscious about the space in that way. That alone already alters your perceptions, and already the cultists are being like, yeah, you've done magic. But then beyond that, you slip on Bela Lugosi's Dead to be really stereotypical and walk with that like slow, like how that song starts, that slow churning, like, and it's just building and like shifting your emotions and making you feel like differently about what this space you're engaging in, and the tension, and what does it mean to be here so close to the dead and so close to your own death and where you might lay one day. And you're just building up your emotions that way. Boom, magic. Those are your tools.
And it's interesting because my initial question was going to be, okay, this seems like a kind of sympathetic magic. How do we separate it from verbena or witchcraft? But it seems to be a sympathetic magic to the idea of emotion as opposed to something maybe more symbolic. Like a hollower who wants to do your Forces 3'2 effect needs to summon rage to shoot that fireball, where the Verbena doing it is going to need some sort of symbol of fire and is not going to go necessarily through that emotional translation layer that it seems like the Goths or the hollowers are drawing power from. Is that reasonable?
I think that's reasonable, but also I want to add on, I think they still are perfectly willing to engage in stilling the symbolism of, in this case, the Verbena that you're talking about,
okay,
to help them, because, you know, you still have plenty of like Gothic witches casting hexes on their enemies, right? Like, like in Mage, lots of times when you say witch, you're thinking of the Verbena, but also I promise you, the Hollow ones are full of witches too. But like they engage in it very differently. And like earlier when we were talking about doing this episode, I said that I felt that the Hollow ones were the most ecumenical of all the traditions. I believe that that's the case because they're willing to steal the aesthetic. They're willing to steal the aesthetic of any culture as long as it enhances their own particular flavor of cool. And in some cases, you are going to have a Hollower who's still engaging with that same symbol that the Verbena is, but also they're doing it for how it makes them feel. And they're doing it for the emotional release. To the Verbena, like, oh, you know, this might be this sacred symbol of fire is how like I interact with the element of fire in a very sympathetic way. But to the Hollower who steals that symbol, it's more like this symbol of fire makes me look like a badass and like I'm a fire witch and we're gonna go to town.
So it's kind of interesting. You now have me saying, in terms of egalitarianism within a tradition or a group, what are we asking you to give up to join, as it were? So like, for instance, the only thing, or what are we asking of you epistemologically to join? And Celestial Chorus, you need to believe that there's one thing and we serve the one thing and we want to go back to the one thing, which is an interesting case where that is a simple belief to state, but for some that is asking a huge amount. So that statement, it sounds like for the Hollowers, are you need to be willing to do a lot of work to look cool.
Yeah, no, that's real. I think you'd agree with me if I said if you were a Hollower who didn't put effort into looking cool, the other Hollow ones aren't going to respect you.
That is the equivalent of the Hermetics reading a 900-page treatise to prove that they care. That is how you would prove intent.
You can't be a Hollow one in jorts and a tank top. You can't.
Okay, second bumper sticker that we're doing.
You can't, like, really, you can't. Yeah. Like, that person isn't going to be a Hollower. The person who's like, I'm going to the grocery store, so I'm going to throw on my, you know, my swimming chunks and my taco sauce stained t-shirt is not a Hollower. They can't be in that group. They can't be in that craft. They can't be in that tradition, however you want to call it, because that's so vital to their belief system and identity.
And that is something that follows them around in the everyday, where the Hermetic may be perfectly comfortable running out to the 7-Eleven to grab something. The Hollower wouldn't be caught dead.
No.
Okay.
Ever. If your image is your perfect raven black hair, your raven black tresses, man, when those roots, those like ash blonde roots start to show, you better take care of that or you're losing it.
So what do you think are some interesting examples then of Goth or Hollower avatars?
In the same way they can borrow from anyone, you could kind of have anything be an avatar, but I don't know, man, there's so many ways to go about this. I recently played a Hollower who was also indigenous and had indigenous heritage and like grew up on the res and stuff like that. And I decided to make that character's avatar an important folk hero in that particular tribe's stories. But the reason I went with folk hero was because I think the concept of being a folk hero ties directly into what the Hollowers are about. They're into making themselves into folk heroes, right? So I actually think if you're going to go, like, especially the primordial direction, a folk hero is a really good direction to go, but it can honestly be any of them. If you're like, man, how do I do something that's actually like avatars, not always, but often are like these sacred figures, right? Mm-hmm. And how do I do that with this group that's like the sacred is bullshit? Well, again, not all the sacred is bullshit, but also like there are ways to still do it. Like I think that if you look at the idea of Hollowers being like modern day, like we're making ourselves folk heroes, you know, you can go that direction for avatars, but also you can go with a lot of different specific aesthetics that might lean that way. Like honestly, in the end, anyone's avatar can be anything. Mm-hmm. That has nothing to do with your choice of tradition. But when you're crafting your character and you want your avatar to lean into this theme and you want to go into that, like you can look at Hollow One avatar, it'd be the reincarnation of Ian Curtis. Like I've got Ian Curtis like singing in my ear about the dead souls and how I've got him telling me about his problems and guiding me along my path. That just popped in my head right now, but now I kind of want to play that holler with the reincarnation of Ian Curtis.
Ian Curtis was the lead singer, the songwriter for Joy Division. I don't remember.
Both.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
So can you give me what you consider to be, to have more things that players can take to the table? When we are thinking in that postmodern vein, what are some examples you feel of a hollower stealing a focus or an idea from another group or paradigm to do an effect? Like, can you run through a couple of them? Like, how would a hollower summon that fireball? Or do they believe they can resurrect the dead? Or how would they control someone's mind? Just like a few effects that you would consider either super goth or super hollower that someone can walk away with. Like, what is the focus and what is the effect?
Instant, like, in-crowd acceptance. You walk up and offer your clothes cigarette to someone or to the group. You're like, hey, or you walk up smoking your clothes and then wordlessly offer the packet, the tin thing that you have open, because you don't do it out of like a cigarette packet, right? You have these little tin things that carry around with the etchings on it, and offer that to the group. Instant acceptance into the group, which could be like a mind or entropy effect, right? So even though the books are always like, they can specialize in any sphere, so a lot of their magic is more coincidental than average. I would say it's more coincidental than even a lot of the convention magic, because they get like really out there sometimes. And so you have a lot of entropy and mind effects, which is, I think, why that's the first thing that came to mind. So you're not necessarily going to have them summoning fireballs in the first place. That's not really quite the aesthetic they're going for. However, you might have something where you're reading a poem around lit candles, and that are part of your thing, like these melted candles that are around you in a circle. And as you're reading the poem, the fire grows brighter and brighter as you intone the lines of the poem more and more. And as you're coming to this point of like explosiveness of emotion in the poem, then you might have a conflagration of those candles. That might be a way I could see them doing something that's closer to a fireball effect. In music performance, you might do a mind effect that allows people to disconnect from grief. So you might perform a song that literally is about grief, that is a sad song, that is about like the loss of, like, the death of a loved one or something like that. Let's say you have a fellow mage in your clique that is so distraught about the loss of their lover that they're going into quiet, right? They're starting to show the signs of going into quiet. You might be able to write a song and play a song for that person that pulls them right back out, because instead of being like, everything is done, everything is useless, I'm alone and empty, nothing can be good again, you're focused instead on the beauty of what that loss was, and why the reason you're feeling those emotions so powerfully is because of how hard you loved.
When normally we do the paradigm conversations, one of my questions is, how is this a paradigm that can fit into any tradition, or is this something that is going to be localized? In this case, do you feel the Gothic or aesthetic can fit into any tradition, or do you feel it is kind of bound?
I think the hardest place to make that fit, I think you probably could fit that into a lot of the traditions. I do think that there's certain things that the traditions demand that make it hard. Certain traditions demand that make it harder. I do believe you could be a skeptic goth who still believes in one god. So let's go with the cliche statement, God is dead. That's a pretty goth thing to say, right? But the beginning of that statement is God existed in the first place. You have to start from a place of being like, if the world is falling apart, and nothing is good, that's why you say God is dead. But also, like, you acknowledge that, well, at one point when God was alive, the world could have been good, or was good, maybe even. And in that case, I could see like a gothy chorister, no problem. And also, if you think about it, I mentioned that they steal a lot of aesthetic from the Verbena, but if you really think about it, the primary place that they steal their aesthetic from is from Christian religion. At least goth stuff, not necessarily all hollow ones, but gothy stuff steals a lot of aesthetic from Christian religion. So you have that. I think the Hermetics, again, like with the indigenous magic one, are probably one of the most challenging, if only because if we're saying House Creamon exists in our game, and not all mage games do, but if we are, I think you can have a lot of gothiness going on there, because they're also very like individualistic, like we do things our own way. You can also, stick them in miscellanea in a lot of ways, but like there's so much like, this is the one true right way and we do it perfectly and no one can say otherwise, that I think it'd be really hard to be a skeptic in that scenario.
I see a goth Bonnie Sages running around out there who is looking for that perfect poem to truly encapsulate how they feel, and will put just as much effort into finding that as a Hermetic will into reciting some bit of Goetia.
That sounds like a cool concept.
And it's like, yeah. Poems are powerful. You just bitches haven't spent enough time finding or writing the right one, and I will show you, and I have it down to a formula, one that you can't understand.
The last character I mentioned, the last Hollow one I mentioned to you that I was playing, or their background, their backstory was that originally they were picked up by the Hermetics and specifically Hashea. And I was talking about how Shea linguistics and symbols are so important to them, and it's the same thing. Like you can absolutely translate over to Goth stuff, because like when you're talking about presenting things in cool and emotionally driving ways, using symbols, like we already mentioned, does that, but also like by invoking specific languages, like we often associate certain feelings and ambiance and emotions with certain languages. Latin has that big feeling of being like this meta language that is kind of coming down from heaven in a way. In this character's specific thing, it was her invoking her indigenous languages and how that empowered her.
Oh, interesting. I do like that as an idea, that you do have that Shia Goth who's like, I believe in the power of words to incite passions. It just so happens that it took me 48 languages to find the right word for the kind of sorrow I wish to describe.
Yeah. Or I had to find this, like, what is it? I think it's in ancient Greek, there's something like 16 different words that mean different kinds of love. Or maybe it's 8. I don't know. It's like, it's a lot of words, the thing that we just use the one word love for. And like maybe you had to like go learning through all these different languages until you found the right one that let you express exactly how you were feeling, because you couldn't do it in whatever language you started with.
Yeah, they had a bunch. I mean, you have eros, sexual passion, agape, which is love of society, storges, which is friendship. I can't remember the one that is like true love, but yeah, they had a bunch running around. Ludus, which I think means game, which I think is kind of flirty stuff, but yeah, I can certainly see that. Are there gothnocrats?
I don't think it's impossible.
Okay.
And I think the best example is Hot Topic Goths, because they're kind of syndicate / NWO Goths. First thing I want to say about that is there's so much commonality between the belief systems of the Etherites and the Hollow Ones that's a really easy jump to make, in my opinion.
Oh, interesting. I would have gone for the Virtual Adepts on kind of on the punk side, where we're all fucked. Let's make a new world.
That's real too, and we can go there.
Okay.
But like what I'm saying is like the cultures that they're drawing from, that both these groups are drawing from, are essentially the same cultures. They just went different directions with them. And you're still going to find plenty of Goths who are using the weird like 70s and 80s like space age kind of like things that like the aesthetic of sci-fi that we don't really associate with sci-fi whatsoever anymore, like the ray guns with the rings around the tips and stuff like that. That's very etheric, but it also, that kind of stuff fits into the same era that Hollow Ones are drawing a lot of their inspiration from. And they also, like you mentioned earlier, how they both had that real big emphasis in their paradigm on creativity. And I would argue that maybe the Etherites don't focus as much on this, but they are both still really big into being individuals. Like my science is this power, like this invention I did is this unique thing that no one else can replicate, because it was like I am the genius that came up with it, and it's like I'm the only one who can make it work, but it works, so it's super cool. That's not that different from what the Hollow Ones are leaning into.
Yeah, what's more individualistic than an entire branch of science that only you can perform?
Also, I think there's some argument to be made that Mary Shelley was one of the very first Hollow Ones, but then if you want to twist it on around, you could say that Mary Shelley was writing some of the first inspiration for the Etherites.
What is the interface then between the Goth worldview and some of the more indigenous or traditionalistic, or what we would call traditional views?
What I would say growing up, being that person, is that you also learn to engage in a healthy dose of skepticism for the way the world is supposedly supposed to be. Because you grow up in a world that is not at all what that world is, and you grow up hearing your histories that is not at all what that world is. And so you have people out here who are being like, the USA is or in my case, right, the USA is the greatest nation in the world for X, Y, and Z reason. You're like, actually, they're the worst nation in the world. And here's my experience living in it, being this kind of person who it got stamped on the forehead of my forefathers and I can't get out from under it. So I think that the whole idea, and also so that's like the very like skeptical postmodern side of it, right? But the other side of it that I would throw out here is, indigenous people in the Americas have been experiencing the end of the world for the last 500 years. So we're pretty good into the Goth aesthetic. You're able to like lean into a little bit, like when that's your existence and you don't have an option and that's just what life is, you lean into like what that means, and like you're able to like have a macabre sense of humor about it. I can make jokes about some horrid shit that my ancestors experienced that helped me move through that, and also I can make art about that stuff that help me move through that and make me feel like I'm more empowered. One of these side art projects I've been working on for the last couple of years, I just do it kind of slowly, but I'm working on it, is I found a bucket of those old plastic cowboys and Indians, and I took out all the Indians, and I've slowly been painting them, and I'm painting each one of them to just be wearing some kind of contemporary outfit or uniform. Like I have you could have just a standard like blue jeans t-shirts one, I have like a UPS driver, and I have like a firefighter. But they're still like painted, like the firefighter is one of these specific models that has like the huge like mohawk style feather headdress, and I painted that in the colors of what the fireman helmet might look like. Like mostly it's just like taking the fact that these toys exist in the way that they do has contributed negatively to my people and to my culture. But also I'm taking it and turning it to an art that I feel is empowering.
Are there any additional thoughts you have on the Magick side or the discussion of the Goth worldview before we start talking more about the Hollowers?
Again, I just would draw it back to like what evinces emotion, and that's not the same for everyone. So like you need to think about your character specific, what's going to make their what's going to enhance their emotions or be able to help them invoke their emotions more powerfully. So I'm talking a lot about like art and music, and we talked a little bit about poetry. I mentioned Mary Shelley, so I can say we talked about stories. Those are all things that do that. But like think about your individual character. It doesn't have to be those things. It could be, honestly, this sounds dorky, but I know people like this. I know people who get really excited and passionate about puzzles. So I don't see why, if you're still evoking the emotion, if you're still evoking the passion, why it couldn't be something that's not obviously like the arts. Oh man, someone's going to get mad about this. Okay. I think that you could make a hollow one who's a furry. Because when you really dive into it, like there's so many jokes and things you can say about them. But one, here's the thing that they have in common, that Goth subculture and furries have in common. They both have a lot of problem getting picked on. Goths less so these days, but definitely back in the day. And they're at the bottom of the social hierarchy, in the broad social hierarchy, not their own social hierarchy. But also, if you really talk to like furries who are super serious about what they're doing, as opposed to just like looking at the stereotypes and making fun of them, the way that they craft their personas and how much thought and emotion and energy and passion they put into creating those characters and how they use them to identify who they are and who they feel that they are on the inside, the way that they're crafting them as their own heroes, essentially, I really feel fits into that same ideology. Now, I don't doubt that if you made a furry hollow one, that you're going to have the rest of the hollow ones being like, what the actual fuck? I still think there's a really valid direction you can go with that if you're willing to do that in a way that is not going to like derail the game that you're playing in with making fun of furries. Like basically, if you do that, if you go that direction, look into what those people actually care about as opposed to like the jokes people make about them.
But the interesting thing there is it fails to me to trigger the end of the world test. Like for Goth, like that everything's going to shit. Like I would be curious to see that furry who's like, everything's going to shit. I'm going to dress up like a giant meerkat.
I imagine that furry one would still be crafting a persona that still has a lot of that goth aesthetic. Like they're still actually a goth person. And also, when you think of furry, you often think of like, foxes and wolves and stuff like that. But there's literally no, as far as I understand, there's no like restriction on what kind of animals you're allowed to use. So why not be a bat furry, or why not be a spider furry?
We've talked about the Hollowers is part of Outcasts, the Book of Outcasts. They get a revised tradition book, but one thing we don't get in the book reviews is either the panoply of them over time or how they're presented in M20. Where are the Hollowers now, like in the contemporary world, and how do they stay relevant, or how do they keep changing?
If we have any like really hardcore goth traditionalists listening to this, they might not like some of what I'm about to say. And I'm sorry ahead of time. I have love for both those who are like, this is what goth was and it will always be this, and those who are moving away from that. I'm sorry ahead of time. There are those who are like, this is what we are and we aren't changing, the traditionalists, who are going to die out. They aren't going to be part of the movement in the future. They aren't going to be part of the continuing goth subculture unless they're willing to embrace change. And some of them are. Some of them are like I will say that like I know traditionalists who are like, hey, we need to talk about how black goth subculture is, because everyone wants to say it's just white for white people. And like we had black musicians in The Cure, we had black musicians in Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, we had black musicians in O Children, like, and that I see as a symbol of them moving past some of their being stuck in the old ways kind of stuff. But also they'll also be in the position that like bands like or like music genres like Gothic metal isn't actually goth, which is understandable because I think the whole like aversion to Gothic metal that exists within the goth traditionalist community mostly comes from aversion to Marilyn Manson. But also like they often see those other genres as co-opting their style as being as instead of being influences and like branches of their style. So there's a lot of like gatekeeping defensiveness of what it is to be that, and that same thing exists in the Hollow Ones. Right. There's a lot of gatekeeping defensiveness of who it is to be, what it is to be a Hollow One, but it isn't really accurate because like when you look at it, like they're talking about how far does their culture go back. Well, I think like arguably it can go back as far as the pyramids, like you said, but like they'll go back to the Romantic era, and none of those people call themselves goths. That didn't exist. And also a lot of the people who they're saying are like original Hollow Ones or original like progenitors of Hollow One thought and thinking didn't like have that goth aesthetic. So things changed over time. And I saw that, I feel like this is related to, you can tell me if I'm off, but I feel like this is related to the question I think came like twice in the Discord about like, where are goths today? How can they stay around? Like pretty much goths are gone, like the whole movement's gone. It's not true. What that statement is a reflection of is that goth culture has always been underground. Goth culture has always been a subculture that was below notice until it got blown up via capitalism in the 90s, which is, again, a lot of the hatred towards Marilyn Manson is he's associated with that event. And so you have both today. You have both aspects of that existing today. You have the Hot Topic goths. You have the baby bats who don't actually know where they're coming from, but they like it for the cute aesthetic. You've got e-girl goths is actually a really big thing. There's all kinds of like monetized kind of like pop culture-y Tim Burton movies, right? You have that super pop culture-ified aspect of quote unquote goth culture that old school goths are like, no, none of that. But then you still have the subculture, the underground culture that exists today that is like, one, still honoring like the late greats, still being like, we're all Joy Division all the time, but also creating contemporary art and music. Goths and Hollow Ones don't care what anyone else thinks of them. They kind of do, but like it's part of their cool thing, the cool shtick, but ultimately they don't care about what the people in power think of them. And so they're not out there trying to like blast a hole in the ground that says I was here. In the Hollow Ones and in goth culture, that's still happening right now. And you could say, oh, well, they're not as relevant as they were then. No, like is it like every third teenager, walking around with like stripy long socks and a Marilyn Manson t-shirt, but Goss would have said that wasn't Gothic culture in the first place. Mm-hmm. Oh, another thing I thought of is when people were like, oh, that whole subculture's dead. I'm like, have you been to Japan? Or have you looked at images from Japan?
Yeah. Spend 15 minutes in Harajuku. Yeah. But that's pretty fascinating. And now that's interesting because like in my head, I see this silent war taking on, like there is a portion of the digital web that is dedicated to TikTok. And I just see it as syndicate brand influencers versus this like the masses of e-girls, and that I want to see that play out in the Ascension War somewhere.
I think that would be a really cool thing to explore as long as you can do it in a cool way and not be shitty towards sex workers.
To go back to the core issue. So one, the subculture itself is evolving where there are new wings or new expressions of goth because every culture changes over time regardless. You will have the traditionalist in the same way that Neville Sinclair really hasn't changed in the last 150 years. That is going to move forward. Would the Hollowers embrace new forms of cool? Is there a Instagram influencer wing of the Hollow Ones, or do they fail the passion test?
Sure, why not? Have you seen, the brush challenge, the pass the brush challenge, where they there's like the video where they'll on Instagram where they'll throw each other a brush and like use it and like turn it into a specific, like dressed up as whatever kind of culture they're doing. So there's goth ones. There's plenty of goth pass the brush challenges.
Okay.
So, and those are viral Instagram memes essentially, right? The pass the brush challenge. Like, okay, here's the other thing I'll throw out there. What's really big on not just Instagram, but also YouTube is makeup tutorials. You can find a whole bunch of goth makeup tutorials. Mm-hmm. And so there's going to be influencers in that way too.
So, okay. So it is not just the quest of cool. It is cool through this passionate shade.
Yeah.
So that kind of answers the question of like, what is the contemporary thing going to do? I think that's also like one of those things where it would be like asking to put it into perspective, like, oh, in 1920s, ray guns and Zeppelins were huge. Where are the Sons of Ether going to go now that those aren't popular in the 30s and 40s? And be like, well, they're still around.
Yeah.
I'm going to jam in one. So the Hollowers kind of had their boom during that commercialized period. And in the metafiction of the game, they draw the modern incarnation of the Hollowers back to the decadence of the 20s, followed by the sense of listlessness about money that it created, the feeling of hollowness, followed by a feeling that all the traditional structures that gave life meaning were destroyed in World War II. And then that was kind of like the second wave of the modern Hollowers. And the Hollow Ones are kind of the newest tradition, as it were, if they were to join the council. Do you have any guesses as to what would come after them?
I don't think that the Hollowers are made of what everyone else threw out. I do think that they picked up a lot of the things that maybe you could have the traditionalists argue that they were throwing out, but in reality, they picked up things that the traditionalists saw as sacred, adopted to their own, and the traditionalists were like, well, they're not sacred to me anymore.
Oh, interesting.
That's not the same thing. That's not the same thing.
It's almost the exact opposite. Rather than picking up what they discarded, they picked up what they held sacred.
But like in a lot of ways that they complain about what the Syndicate has done through Hot Topic to them, they kind of did that to other traditions. Except I would argue that they didn't do it with the intent of making it irrelevant. They did it with the intent of making it relevant to them because it wasn't before. The beliefs of the traditions are pretty irrelevant to them, but they could use the trappings of the traditions to make it into something relevant. So is the question like what subculture might replace them as like a group of a tradition based in a subculture? Or an existing...
Really either, because when I think about it, several traditions had their dominant periods of time. And again, this is going to be admittedly Western. You have the idea, if we go back in time, you had the Qin dynasty, which was the most powerful on the face of the planet at the time. Cool beans. And that you could argue then that some weird form of Proto-Akashic were the most powerful tradition on the face of the planet. And then at another point, it went to the Verbena, and the Dream Speakers present themselves as having been basically what everyone was in a sufficiently far back time. Before the gauntlet had gone up, everyone was a Dream Speaker, and the notion of magic was kind of ridiculous. It just so happened that there was these certain subsect that maintained the ability to do magic after the sundering happened, or the shattering, after the gauntlet went up. And then we kind of get this technological progression that you had their Hermetics that eventually gave way to the Sons of Ether as the new cool kids, who eventually gave way to the Virtual Adepts as the new cool kid. And before the Hermetics, you had the Chorus, the power of the church, is kind of the dominant thing. So you can kind of make this timeline of seemingly when each tradition was at their apex, and they were invariably bumped off by some new paradigm that the world embraced that made powerful. Is there a next paradigm?
Yes. But I actually don't know how much relationship it has specifically to if the Hollow Ones became more established. One, I don't think they're ever going to be. I think kind of the way in the theme they were written, it was never like the fight about them trying to be more established is there, but it's not something they can win, which is part of what we want to be a discussion of, like, what are the traditions doing right and wrong? Well, how are they treating the Hollow Ones, right? So first of all, I don't think they can actually do that. I don't think they should. I think them joining the Disparate Alliance is actually a better direction to go, with them actually having any kind of a structure, like factional structure. That said, if we were going to look at the next group that was like the Mavens of the Ascension War, I actually think it'd be kind of like not actual virtual adepts, but like kind of like something the virtual adepts have unintentionally created. Arguably, the virtual adepts have succeeded in parts of their Ascension War goals. You have so many people living online and living in their online lives as an alternate reality, in some cases an enhanced reality. Like, do you remember like in the 90s when if you like met someone online who you're romantically interested, everyone would be like, oh my God, you're going to get killed. Like everything is going to go wrong. This person's going to be a nightmare crazy person or whatever. Today, it's normal. They've kind of built maybe I would say a reality 1.5, right? Not a reality 2.0, but reality 1.5. And the people who are growing up in that reality without having any experience of anything else, the people who see it as like, what's normal is us being on the other side of the country, being friends and talking all the time, and also recording this podcast together. That's not normal. If it was in the 90s, this would be a special event. It'd be really difficult to pull off. Like, one of us might have to fly out to see the other one, something like that. Instead, you have it where all of it's super normalized. And then you also, so here, I'm going to draw upon a real world event about what kind of group do we see. It's a group that doesn't necessarily take itself that seriously, but also really cares. And the thing that we're talking about literally the weekend we were recording this is that rally that Trump had in Tulsa, and how they were like, we're going to sell, we've sold millions of tickets, like millions, not sold millions, but millions of people asked. We built this massive overflow area from our 19,000 seater arena because there's so many people going to be outside, and we've got like stages out there so we can make extra speeches from the president, the vice president, to the people who can't even get in. And like, they also spent all this energy like recording all the data from the people that requested tickets and like understanding these new demographics and like essentially being it's the story goes way beyond the fact that only 6,000 people showed up when they're expecting like tens and tens of thousands. It goes into like, you know,
thank
the
you,
Trump
K-pop stands.
yeah, K-pop stands, and honestly just TikTok teens, right? Like you know, it goes into like the Trump campaign thrives off of its data management, which we talked about early on with Trump, with how Cambridge Analytica works, right? And they've essentially, like, the campaign was so invigorated and so excited about how many people they thought wanted to see go to this rally. And so they invested a lot of time, money, and energy into taking the data from all these requests and all these people who were communicating with them and being like, here's our people, here's how we're going to market, here's how we're going to win, here's how we're going to get these votes. And all of that is wasted. You have a lot of them who are like, we care because Trump's a monster, right? And sorry about getting a little political, but that's why they did it. But also you have plenty of them who are like, we're doing this because we're causing chaos in this system and we kind of want to see it break down. And I don't know how better to define what that group would be, because I don't, like, you could say, oh, that does sound like something virtual adepts would do, except these weren't virtual adepts.
Yeah, and to me, the virtual adepts fundamentally failed. The more time I think about it, the less I like the virtual adepts, because of how much they tried to take a public good and make it theirs.
Yeah.
Like, you read Digital Web 2.0 and you're like, every time you've been on the internet for a while and you have a headache, that is the quintessence leaving your body, powering the digital web. And the virtual adepts want it all themselves. I'm like, bitch, you're taking my quintessence. I got a slice of this shit too. It just comes off like entitled white people. Like, I fully recognize the existence of Dante, but like, oh man, they have not aged well.
I would say if you want to look at who the virtual adepts are today, like, look at Anonymous. And while you can argue, yeah, there's some cool things Anonymous does, you can also be like, there's a bunch of trash they do. Like, they're a lot of times they're just a waste of space. Like, there isn't a lot of like specific, we know exactly who these people are. Mm-hmm. But for the amount that we do, they're people with means and money who are like, our emphasis is on, like, we think the world's going to be better if information is free and if everyone knows everything. But we might have all these resources and money that we're not necessarily helping anyone with. And on the other hand, like, the reason I'm saying this group isn't virtual adepts and isn't them at all, is because they are a product of something the virtual adepts did. They are a product of the virtual adepts' impact on the global paradigm. But also, I think that they come from there are a lot more diverse communities. So you know how, like, you'll get primarily from white folks in response to the George Floyd protests being stuff like, why does everyone all of a sudden hate cops? Part of that revelation for the dominant culture, which in this case I'm describing whiteness. We can describe the dominant culture as men or as people with money, but in this case I'm talking about whiteness, is that the internet has really leveled the field when it came to learning about people's experiences. Mm-hmm. Because previously, when you had our culture dominated by whiteness, our media and news sources were dominated by whiteness telling white stories. Our academic institutions were dominated by whiteness telling white stories. And so a lot of the social information that is coming to us is coming from the lens of whiteness. But now that you have the internet and you literally can't stop an Indian, a black person, a Mexican, whatever, you can't stop those people from just putting their opinion on the web. And then another black person or Indian being like, yeah, me too. And then a whole bunch of them talking about it and it blowing up. Like, there's no gatekeeping. There is some gatekeeping. Like, you can argue, like, Facebook, like, if you write white men, it automatically bans your post. But it won't do that if you write the N-word. But like, so there is some gatekeeping. But by and large, the way that we exist on the internet now has created this flow of information from communities that have not been listened to before, which in this case hugely involves young people. But now, like, the opinions of teenagers essentially destroyed this multi-million-dollar effort that the Trump campaign put into getting him reelected.
So I like that. So your new tradition is going to be generally younger, generally more diverse. It is probably going to be anarchic or anarcho-syndicalist. It is going to have an extreme skepticism to structures of power. So in the same way that the hollow ones have a skepticism of the sacred or things that are emotion that is used to manipulate people, this may be a more direct attack on those wheels of power. And to me, I think the other aspect of it would be some sort of radical acceptance. Some more questions, I guess, about the hollow ones. One thing I guess we didn't do is, what is the difference then just between the hollow ones and being a goth?
So you know how when earlier I kind of briefly touched on it, but like one of the kind of big criticisms of goths is that you're not individualists, you're all a bunch of conformists because you all look exactly the same. Well, that is a real issue, and there is a lot of gothicness. There's a lot of like existence within the culture that, again, you're going to have elitists be like, no, these people aren't goths, but they are in the culture, and in many ways, because of how they appear and how they act, they represent it too. So you're going to have a lot of like conformists who are never going to be people who awaken. You're going to have people who are there only because it's cool. Like the cool is really important, but the people who are there just for the social status and that alone, they're never going to get into what the hollow ones care about. They're never going to get in. They're never going to awaken. Like I think the Hollow Ones Revised has mixed messaging on this, but I would argue that if you're the kind of goth who purely embraces nihilism and nothing else, you're probably not going to awaken. Again, I'm going to acknowledge that the established canon does say that those kinds of people can awaken and become Hollow Ones, but my feeling is that if you don't have a spark of power, of empowerment or hope or something that's in that vein, anywhere, because you can't become awakened, you can't reach that kind of enlightenment. You're missing like this vital step. Like what everyone awakens in different ways, but it's always related to some level of self-empowerment, which I think is why this game is compelling anyway, because like we can engage in like these self-empowerment fantasies, which when in a world where you often feel really helpless, feels really good. So I don't think that those kinds of people in the goth culture can awaken. Here's another like indirect way of answering that question. Goth culture does deal with some problems of white supremacy and fascism a little bit. I would say in the same way that like pagan culture deals with it. Like obviously it's like a smaller group, but also it's a very vocal, loud group that has a lot of influence. And while I don't see anything stopping from people like that from awakening, I don't think by and large the Hollow Ones are going to be very accepting of those people. So even though you might like initially awaken and have like a lot of the trappings that appear like that's who you are, I think you'd get a lot of social kickback from them because they're very open and accepting. Like goth experience, like it's kind of like with nerd culture. I think nerd culture, not always, obviously there's huge problems with white dude nerds especially in certain communities, but nerd culture can often be a little bit more accepting of people when they realize that those people have been picked on or bullied or oppressed, because they're like, oh yeah, I get it. Like I was picked on for like liking Doctor Who or whatever. Or I was picked on for liking Ninja Turtles. Even though there's a lot of still shortcomings, there can still be a little bit of understanding there. So in the same way, like if you're like a fascist goth who's like a gatekeeper, who's like, I don't want people with dark skin, or I don't want people who think that anyone but like The Cure and whoever else is a goth band, like those people might get rejected.
If Rich Thomas comes to you and says, I would like you to be the lead developer on a update to the Hollow Ones, what would be in there that maybe wouldn't be in the established material so far? Are there any changes that you would like to see made? Are there any updates that you would like to have made?
M20 touched on one aspect of a thing you just said, and that making the Hollow One art a Harajuku girl. So that way it was kind of like, even without directly saying it, they were telling the fans like, hey, look beyond, UK and American culture. You talked about this a few times about how like the mage history of the Hollow Ones is like barely there, and I think with some good reason. But I actually think there's a lot to be explored there. One of the questions that came up, again, related to like the Harajuku girls was like, oh, like, what about global Hollow Ones? They're all just like, UK American white kids. And I'm like, well, for one, I think that a lot of the Hollow One philosophies actually came out of different parts of Europe. Like a lot of it was coming out of the French Revolution too, which we didn't even talk about. But also you're missing some really important influences on their beliefs. Like from Argentina, you got like Esteban Echeverria, and then you also have like Jorge Luis Borges, who I feel are South American writers who, if you look at what they're writing, like they were Hollow Ones. They were absolutely speaking with that voice that at least ended up being something that influenced what we look at as being Hollow One stuff today. And like I would love to see a take on them that explores their globalness a lot more, especially because if we did do a current version of them, we'd have to talk about them in relationship to the Disparate Alliance. And the Disparate Alliance is very, very, very not white. they're next to maybe like the Sisters and the Templars are like, and I would say the Sisters actually are probably pretty brown if you really think about it. But so maybe the Templars and them are like the only like real either European or American focused groups, North American focused groups, and everyone else is like from the rest of the world for the most part. Everyone else is from the very brown parts of the world. And so like, what is the relationship with them like? Like, what made them want to, like, the obvious answer to like what made them want to work together is they all hate the Nefandi. That's basically why that alliance exists. They're like, let's get rid of the Nefandi. And unlike the traditions of the technocracy, they could see that the fact that there was Nefandi within the ranks of those groups, and they had to be rooted out. Because it basically both traditions and technocracy, even if they do know it, they can't let people know it. So like they kind of hide the fact that they have corruption in their ranks. And the alliance is like, no, get rid of that shit too. And also, we never liked you guys in the first place, so it's really easiest for us to make excuses to fight with you. But like, I'd want to talk about their global relationship. I want to talk about their relationship with the other members of, like, you know how like every single tradition book has that one short little section about here's my relationship with each other tradition. I want to do that, but for their relationships with all the other disparate crafts, and then maybe like talk about a little bit of history. Honestly, like, I want to be clear. The whole Disparate Alliance thing, that's something Sater came up with, but he and I talked a lot about it at the time. I don't know who he talked to, quote unquote, the most about it, but I don't feel like I was a small part of that discussion. I feel like it was a lot of stuff that we talked about, because a lot of stuff that we talked about ended up in the book. So when we were talking about it, it wasn't very strictly defined, like what events made this happen, what did it look like? And I'd love to see stuff that explored how that ended up working out that way. On top of that, I look at all those other subcultures, like you have like Hawaiians, like Native Hawaiians, you have Muslims, and I think about how literally all these other global ethnic groups that these other crafts are drawing from also have Goths. And like, I want to write about those Goths. Whenever I hear like American, UK, Canadian people complain, or not complain, but like comment that the Gothic culture is dead. It's long gone. It's a thing of the past. When you like look at any of what's going on in Brazil, like go look at any Brazilian protest, and it's like a bunch of Goths. And like Brazil is extremely historically multicultural, right? You have white, black, indigenous influence, like that today, like here in the Americas, the colonizers were so efficient at not only wiping out indigenous people, essentially like completely destroying the paths of hope for black people, that didn't happen the same way in Brazil. You still had slavery and wiping out indigenous people, but not in the same way, not in the same degree. And so today, while you see the U.S. like dominated by whiteness, there it's like a very strong mix. And while I'm not going to go out on a limb and be like, well, that means there's no racism, they have their own problems. But it does mean that you have a variety of influences that here, like, you only tend to hear one side of the story, and there it's like it comes from a lot of different directions. And so I feel like being able to talk about what it is to be a Goth in Brazil would be really exciting.
What I think will be the last two questions before I open up the floor for any final thoughts you have is, one of the questions that came up in multiple cases is, for someone who is either not from the US or who is younger and did not experience the wave of Goth going through the culture, if someone wants to get up to speed on it quickly, what cultural touchstones do you think they can look at? Like, what is your short list of maybe books, movies, or bands to kind of get that quick slice?
For books, you're going to want to look into poetry. I'm going to go back and say, look at Borges. Also, Edgar Allan Poe, obviously, is a big, obvious example. And honestly, if you start with those two, you could probably just find a host of others that have related writings. But I really feel like the best thing that you're going to be able to do to get a good feel of what it means to be Goth is to explore the music. But I want to emphasize that you can start with what's called traditional Goth music, but you really need to move past that. If you haven't heard Bauhaus, if you haven't heard Susie and the Banshees, if you haven't heard The Cure, if you haven't heard Joy Division, you are absolutely missing a vital part of what it is to be Goth or to be a Hollow One. You have to have that basis, but you can't stop there. Definitely, you don't need to go looking into Marilyn Manson. That's the wrong direction to start expanding into. You're going to miss the point if you start going down that road. Instead, I want people to start looking at things that aren't maybe necessarily traditionally labeled Goth, but are still capturing the essence and ambience of what it means to be Goth. So like the devotion to those three passions that we described, like horror, terror, and grief. And you're going to be looking at bands like Lost Tribe. Honestly, there's a musician who I don't think anyone would want to call Goth, but I think is Goth. It's Serpent with Feet. This, Sal Williams is really hip hop, but I feel like the things that Sal Williams is talking about are 100% in the vein of what it is to be Goth. And there's also like a lot of, like, there's like, I mentioned before, Light Asylum. Don't skip Light Asylum. They are actually pretty goth, but they're also more contemporary goth. So check out Light Asylum for that reason. I mentioned Public Enemy, which again, people aren't normally associating with goth, but that ambiance, what they're talking about, what their themes are, it absolutely is. You want to check out Marissa Nadler. You want to check out Chelsea Wolfe.
And for those of you who prefer music that's at least 300 years old, I strongly recommend Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor, Mussorgsky's Night on Bald Mountain, and Camille de Saint-Saëns. But that's just me. And ultimately, what makes a good hollow one? Like, if I'm building a hollower character, what are the things where you're like, yeah, this really needs to be there, and if you figure this out, you've nailed it?
I think we're going to go back to the beginning of the episode. It's finding the beauty in the awfulness of the world. It's remembering that when your mother dies and you are gripped with all of this awful feeling of grief and loneliness and emptiness and disconnection and like self-immolation, that the reason that exists, the reason that feeling exists, is because you had a space in you that was full of your love and passion for her, and now it's hollow, but that love and passion still exist. And that's why you feel that way. Like when you see the world burning, when you see the world dying, when you see it erupting in hate, when you see the planet like choking itself to death, and you feel like you can't get out of bed, the reason that you have those feelings is because of your love for the world. And you need to remember that love part, that passion part. Those things matter.
And Mage is ultimately a game about people who choose to act. So the ones that choose to stay in bed are probably not mages. And just as a note, many of these questions were collected from our Discord server, discord.me/matesthepodcast. Thank you to World Jumper, JMags, Elon Rouge, and Pulp Action Boy for submitting questions, as well as a few others that I may have already had, so I rolled it in. But thank you so much for participating there. James is also in our Discord periodically. So we've covered my thing. Is there anything else you'd like to make sure the audience knows? Or alternatively, are there any projects from you we should look forward to seeing in the future?
I'm excited about Werewolf 5th, whether or not wherever that's going to be when this episode comes out.
Yeah. We'll be on Werewolf 6 by the time this goes. No.
Oh, God. I did sign on to work on the Technocracy Reloaded companion, so I'll have some stuff in there. And other than that, like, I do love talking about music. If you can tell, like, I'm not only into, like, goth stuff, I'm just a music snob, honestly, is what I've been called. For funsies, I've been making big playlists on all the different werewolf tribes. And so if you want to, like, just in general get into, like, music nerdery with me, you can check those out and talk about why I picked them if you're into that kind of stuff. I actually thought really hard about doing a Hollow One playlist for this, but then I was like, you know what? It's not that really hard to just like whip up like go to Spotify and write like goth music and find like really good playlists. So there's not really no point for me to make a new one.
Unless it were a case where there was some need for curation, where if you type in goth and the first thing you get is Marilyn Manson, then that's kind of something that you want to dodge.
I might be able to play around with that, but also here, actually, I'm not going to do it. What I am going to say is Satyr has something like 5 different playlists. They're all like all the goth music he loves, and he's the one who writes this game more than like lots of people have written this game, but like his fingers on it more than anyone else in the world. So if you want to get a feeling for his own goth feelings and tastes, like just go to check his playlist out, and he's got some really good stuff on there. He's also I haven't even mentioned in this episode, and I should have. Like his number one goth band is The Killing Joke, and The Killing Joke is rad, and you should listen to them too.
Actually fronted by Alan Moore. So and with that, James, thank you so much for your time. Where can we choose to follow your work if we wish to?
Oh, you can follow me at JFHigh, H-I-G-H on Twitter. I don't care if you had me as a friend on Facebook, but if you are a fascist troll, you will be deleted and blocked. And also you can find me at, my Twitter is actually, sorry, my Facebook is JF Sambrano. And then you can find me on Patreon as JF Sambrano as well, which is where I'm doing most of those playlists I was mentioning. And they're totally free. I do very little paywall content. You can get most of my stuff on there for free.
And you have, I think, one of the best sets of Patreon support tier names that I think I've ever encountered. So I am not going to tell you what they are, listener. Just go there and you will get a treat.
It's a joke about how people treat indigeneity, since I write a lot about that. So
James, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
You've been listening to Mage the Podcast. You can subscribe to our show on Spotify, Anchor, TuneIn, iTunes, Google Play Podcasts, or the podcatcher of your choice. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform you're choosing, or at least tell some of your friends about us. We really appreciate it. We have a hopping Discord community at discord.me/matesthepodcast, and you can also give us your thoughts and feedback over email at matesthepodcast@gmail.com or on Twitter @matesthepodcast. If you'd like to support us and get a cool chat color in Discord, go to magethepodcast.com and click on Become a Supporter. This episode is made possible by the support of our executive producers, and they are Anders, Andrew K., Andrew E., Brendan, Bryce Perry, Christopher P., Chris Sack, Ira Grace, Justin, John Magnuson, Michael Parker, Richard Bat Brewster, and William. Also go to Mates the Podcast for show notes and all of our other previous shows. Our random limerick for a executive producer this week is for Andrew K. There once was a donor named Andrew K., whose very deeds were quite fearsome to say. He slayed bygone beasts and hosted umbral feasts, but to list more would just be cliché. As a note, the word cliché is thought to be onomatopoetic, imitating the sound of overused printing plates striking each other, from the original French, cliché. And with that, bye!